We've visited the Australian Army Flying Museum at Oakey several times in the past to interview Air Force Chinook pilots, cover the Black Hawk and the Iroquois in Vietnam. Today, we return to Oakey where the curator of the museum, Scott Downs, takes us on a grand tour of Australian Army aviation history.
Well, g'day and welcome to the Australian Army Flying Museum. I'm Scott Downs, I'm the curator here. Now, the story of Army aviation is very different to that of the Air Force within Australia. Obviously, the Army was flying before the Air Force. The Air Force didn't start until 1921. So the whole First War, the whole Great War, was flown by Army pilots and Army aircrew. With that, there was a big conference in London in 1911. The whole empire comes together and it's about the coming war. The Imperial General Staff is convinced they need to get involved in this newfangled aviation thing. And in 1911-12, the Royal Flying Corps is started, and it brings under its umbrella all flying. So observation balloons and anything that flies is brought under that Royal Flying Corps banner. Australia in a unique move, and it's unique in the Empire. No one else tries this, not the Canadians, not the Kiwis, nobody. We form our own independent air element, and it starts at the Central Flying School. It's a very bold move for a government which is only at this point about 10 years old. Considering, and aviation's only about 8 or 9 years old, to start a flying corps of its very own. We do that, and it takes us a long time to get going. We have to import people from England, we have to import aircraft from England and so forth. But on the 1st of March 1914, we take to the skies in one of these. It's a Bristol Boxkite. It's a 1910 design, it's a British design. As you can see, it's a biplane. And it's very much first generation, and we use it from 1914 until 1918 as a first generation trainer. Now we've got it set up here in our museum with a single seat, but in the real world it would have had a twin seat with the instructor sitting behind and basically teaching someone to drive like we would think of teaching our granddaughter or daughter to drive. You had no ability to affect the controls, so the trainee was on the controls while the instructor basically yelled in their ear. And that was pretty much it. It was a really great trainer. It was a blistering success in Australian service, the Boxkite. We used them, like I said, from 1914 to 18. And now I'm going to take you around the corner and show you the next aircraft off the rank, which is the first of our ab initio single-seat trainers. So the second aircraft that I want to show you today is the Deperdussin. Now the Deperdussin was bought initially as the ab initio single-seat trainer. All that means is you fly it by yourself. You put in the aircraft on your own. It wasn't a great success as that aircraft. The main reason for that is the way that it's controlled. It's what we call the wing warper. So the controls, the aircraft is actually controlled by changing the geometry of the wings by pulling and pushing on the controls. It's a very difficult aircraft to fly for someone who's a trainee. Now, the other part of that was probably the fact that in 1914 there wasn't a great training system. As we speak in 2024, so 110 years later, a pilot can expect to get somewhere in the region of 350 hours before they're an aircraft captain, before they graduate off their pilot course as an Army helicopter pilot. In 1914, a trainee was given 2 hours in a Boxkite and then put into the Deperdussin by himself. In our service, it was the first aircraft that we took a fatal casualty in. The aircraft hit wires at the end of the airfield at Point Cook, and the pilot was subsequently killed in the crash. The Deperdussin was quickly taken out of service. The wings were sawn off the aircraft, and it was used after that for taxi training and maintenance training only. The aircraft you see in front of you is a replica built by a man called Jack Gillies. He started that when he was 80. He started this project as a love job, for want of a better term. When he was 80, he finished it when he was 84, and he subsequently donated it to our museum. He built it from a set of plans that his father had liberated in 1915 from his time at the Central Flying School. So yeah, it's quite an interesting story just on the replica that we have. So the next aircraft that we're going to look at is the Bleriot XI. Now it's a French design by, funny old thing, Monsieur Bleriot, and it's the 11th version of this aircraft, and it probably becomes the most important aircraft in his series. We bought 2 of them to replace the Deperdussins almost straight away. So by 1915, we're flying these aircraft at the Central Flying School. And they're used for that same job, the ab initio single-seat trainer. As you can see though, if you look behind me, it's still a wing warper. It's still using that same technology that the Deperdussin did. However, when Bleriot was designing this aircraft, he changed the control system, put some more levers inside there, gave it more mechanical advantage, so you didn't have to push as hard. So suddenly the aircraft was vastly more controllable. Now, like I said, we bought 2. We ended up with 3 as one of the very rich grazier's sons who wanted to be an Australian Flying Corps pilot. Tried to apply, was told he probably wasn't the right candidate, then rolls in about a week later flying a Bleriot, lands it at Point Cook and says, I bought my own aeroplane, can I be a pilot now? And funny old thing, he was in. So kids out there in YouTube land, if you want to be a Royal Australian Air Force jet fighter pilot, you just need about a lazy $70 million, buy yourself an F-35 and you'll get a job. No. It was a wonderful success. We used it right through until the disbandment of the AFC. It's got a couple of other really important milestones though. It's not in Australian service, but just in general for aviation. Bleriot himself was the first person ever to fly the English Channel, and he flew it in a Bleriot 11. So he goes Calais, Dover, and he does it in about 40 minutes. Okay, he leaves Dover, gets blown out into the North Sea, comes back, lands in Dover. It's part of a big competition that was being run in London at the time, you know, by one of the big newspapers and one of the big supermarkets, and big publicity stunt sort of thing. But in that instant, he's suddenly made the world smaller, because before he lands there, the quickest way across the channel is in a steamer. It's about a 2.5 hour ride. Suddenly it's a 40-minute ride. You know, a few weeks later, someone loads one of these up, puts extra fuel tanks in it, flies London, Paris in about 3 hours, and suddenly the world's shrinking really fast. And that's one of the things Army Aviation does on a battlefield. Normal patrol pace in primary rainforest is about, you know, somewhere between 1,000 metres an hour and 1,000 metres a day. It's very, very slow. And that's somewhere like Vietnam. In Vietnam, as we know, a lot of the soldiers rode helicopters often. In the back of a helicopter, you're doing 3,000 metres a minute. So the battlefield is smaller. And in our most recent conflicts, so in the Middle East and Afghanistan and so forth, we can make it safer, because we can pick a soldier up from one place, take him across and land him at another place without the risks of IEDs and so forth. So we make the battlefield smaller and we make it safer. It's one of Army Aviation's main sort of roles on a battlefield. And the last thing is, this was the first aircraft ever used in offensive combat. The Italian Army took some of these down to Libya. They were fighting an insurgency against Bedouin tribesmen out in the desert. They were being tacitly supported by the Ottomans, but they were fighting this insurgency, and they were basically getting the bomb, the explosive projectile that comes out of an artillery gun, screwing a contact fuse into the end of it, sitting it on their laps, and as they found the Bedouins out in the desert, they'd literally flick past that bomb over the trailing edge of the wing, trying to land it on said Bedouins. So they were held up pretty much. They were going to be charged with war crimes by the International Criminal Court, the Hague. And in the end, they found no case to answer, but it's a point of divergence. It's 1911, and it's just before the big game kicks off in 1914. It's that moment in time where, you know, if aviation or aviators are suddenly charged, tried and executed by the International Criminal Court, maybe aviation withers on the vine and doesn't become the decisive battle implement that it does become in 1914, but it goes the other way and it blossoms and blooms and explodes. As we know, in 1914-18, aviation becomes the newest and most important military technology in the world. So the next aircraft we're going to look at is the Sopwith Camel. The Sopwith Camel is a development of earlier aircraft, but around about December of 1916, so late 1916, it's first deployed onto the battlefield. It's a difficult aircraft to fly, but once you master the aircraft, it is an unbelievably capable air superiority fighter. Its whole job is to shoot down other fighters. It doesn't have a secondary role. By this time, by about halfway through the Great War, various air forces are working out that there are various jobs that aircraft do well and other things that they do poorly and so forth. The Camel's a great example of that, being a pure fighter. Other aircraft that the AFC were flying at the time are aircraft like the F-2B, the Bristol F-2B, which was a two-seater fighter, but could also be used for observation and photographic missions and so forth. And that leads me kind of into where aviation came from, or what it did in the First World War. As we know, the Great War was a very finite conflict. It was down that trench line which ran effectively from the North Sea to the Swiss border, right through the middle of France. And we have this concept in our heads because of the way we've been taught at school with all the photos and stuff, that the whole of France is obliterated. It's a big mud pie. That's very much not true. It's a very finite conflict. It's only about 15 Ks or maybe even 10 Ks either side of the front line. So it was easy to take photographs and do the reconnaissance in the battle space and find out what was happening just outside the battle space and inside the battle space. So where the enemy are digging trenches, where they're holding their cavalry, where their stores depots are, where they're building railways and so forth and so on. But to study that, we needed photographs. So every day from right at the beginning of August 1914, aircraft were being launched to take photos of what the opposition were doing. And the cameras improved and the aircraft improved, but right through the war, they took photographs. And it is possible, if you go to the Imperial War Museum in London, it is possible to get a photo mosaic map of the entire British sector of every day of the conflict because of the amount of photos they took. Obviously, the enemy wants to stop us taking photos and we want to stop the enemy taking photos. So we would launch fighters to shoot them down, and that's basically where it came from. Now, that is the first and most important role of aviation on any battlefield, is reconnaissance. And we still spend, defence and nations still spend the most money on their reconnaissance aircraft. And often when I get people in here, they'll say, no, they don't. An F-35 fighter's worth, $70 million, and it's not a reconnaissance asset, it's a pure fighter. The reality is the most expensive aircraft we run are satellites, and they only do one job, and that's take photos. So even though they're not in atmosphere, they're still a flying machine, and they take photographs. So it's still the most important and basic role. So when you look at the aircraft behind me, there's a few things to sort of notice about a pure fighter in a First World War fighter. They had to be almost out of control. They were at the edge of controllability, and pure fighters are still that to this day. And to achieve that in the First World War, you'll note the aircraft behind me, and they're all very similar. All the heavy things in the aircraft are in a very small space. So the pilot, the undercarriage, the guns, the fuel, the ammunition, all the very dense, heavy things are in a very small space, almost in a ball shape, around the centre of the aircraft. They've got short wings, it's got a short wingspan, but there are many of them, 2 and in some cases 3 wings, so biplanes, triplanes. They're also very short coupled, so from motive power, the propeller, to the tail, the empennage, the rudder and the elevator, it's a very short space. So when these aircraft launched off the ground, almost from the instant you were airborne, the aircraft was on the edge of controllability. And all the aircraft doing that job were very much like that. And you can see that when it comes together behind you. And probably the last point, you'll note the guns, the 2 guns that fire through the propeller. Now they're synchronised guns. For the first 18 months or so of the war, the Allies had no synchronised guns. And we were trying to find ways of doing that. And in fact, Roland Garros, Roland Garros in France, where the French Open's held, it's named after a man actually called Roland Garros. He was the first French ace, the first French person to shoot down 5 aircraft. He did it with guns shooting through the propeller with deflectors on it too. When the bullets actually hit it, they would deflect them away. But by that point, the Germans had invented or were applying synchronisation, and there was a time called the Fokker Scourge and so forth. It was a really terrible time. We were sort of building 17 aircraft to one, training about 18 pilots to one, the Allies, and we were still losing the air battle to the Fokkers. So there was a whole bunch of stuff. We had to steal the technology, apply the technology. By about 1916, halfway through 17, we are starting to get air superiority, and pretty much the Germans can't get that back with the amount of aircraft they can create and the constraints that their resources apply to them. They can't get that back ever, except locally when they bring, the flying circus, Richthofen and his flying circus. They would move to a space in the battle, get local air superiority for a period, for 3 weeks or something. Great misconception. People think that the flying circus was called the flying circus because of all the colours on Richthofen's squadron's aircraft. It wasn't. It was because they were like a circus. They came to town. They were intense, they came here and then they went there. and they would go and they would get local air superiority for a period, maybe it's 3-week or month period, and then they would move on and get air superiority for another attack or to blunt a British or French attack. So it was quite an interesting period. Lastly, everything that we do in the military, pretty much every single thing that we do as military aviators was defined by the end of 1918. So close air support, air superiority, strategic bombing, strategic transport, tactical bombing, tactical transport. Almost every job that we do had been defined by 1918. The only things that are new in the aviation world is in the Second World War in 1940, the Germans applied parachuting, so airborne operations, and it was a great success and was used, as we know, through all Saving Private Ryan and all the rest of it through many parts of the war in the Second World War. But then just after the war, about 1948, the theory of air mobility came to being. And then by about 1960, the aircraft had been developed to create an air mobile element within defence forces around the world. So they're the only two new things. Everything else has been around since, well, day one pretty much. So the aircraft above, hanging in the roof space there, is a Handley Page O400. Now, I just wanted to show you this one specifically because it is a really important but forgotten part of Australia's aviation heritage. It's part of X-ray Flight 1 Squadron Australian Flying Corps, and it was part of the Palestinian campaign. And as we know, and we've seen, virtually everyone's seen the movie, we've heard the story of Lawrence of Arabia and his ability to bring the Arabs together, form the Arab revolt and revolt against the Ottoman Empire, giving them a running saw which really was a force multiplier for the British Expeditionary Force in Palestine. With that, 1 Squadron was tasked with supporting him, and the aircraft behind me is a bomber, a twin-engine bomber, and it could carry up to 2,000 pounds of bombs, or take the bombing section out of the middle, and it could carry 2,000 pounds of freight, or 2,000 pounds of people, or 2,000 pounds of whatever stores Lawrence needed to continue his operations with the Arabs. The pilot, generally speaking, was a guy called Ross Smith, and his fabled efforts in Australian aviation is once again almost forgotten, but he was the guy that was the first person, he won the London-Sydney air race in 1919 after the war was finished, flying a similar aircraft, a Vickers Vimy. But with his Handley Page O400, he would land in the desert to unprepared airfields in the dark with no instruments. He would bring this monster aircraft down. Now, the aircraft we've got in here is a model, and it has to be a model because it wouldn't fit, the actual aircraft wouldn't fit inside this building. It has a 100-foot wingspan. So the last aircraft we were looking at, the Camel, if you look at the aircraft stub wings, the lower wings behind me, they will fit 2 under each wing outside the wheels. So 2 of those will go under each wing. An X-ray Flight was equipped with 2 Camels, 2 F2Bs and the Handley Page O400, used in the vast majority of cases as a stores and clandestine, to move people clandestinely around the battle space. But yeah, it's like a very small but astonishingly skilled part of Australia's First World War, Great War aviation heritage. So the Great War ends on, well, the armistice comes around on the 11th of the 11th, 1918, and the shooting stops. As we know, the war doesn't finish until 1921 when the actual treaty is signed. But the ceasefire happens in 1918. And it's a wonderful moment, obviously, for the world, because at this point, about 10 million people have died. The vast majority of them were soldiers, because it was a very finite conflict. But about 10 million people have been killed in this conflict, so it's a marvellous moment in sort of human history. As part of that, there is a peace dividend, and this happens basically every time any conflict finishes, and that's basically the government getting the money out of armies and navies and putting it back into the community, into schools and hospitals, where it belongs. As part of that, the AIF, the Australian Imperial Force, is disbanded in its entirety. So it was a completely volunteer force, hostilities only, and comes home, is demobilised and sent back to work, for want of a better term. As part of that, the AFC is disbanded. So after about 1918, there is no air element to the Australian Defence Force. As we know, after about 1916, not early in the war. Early in the war had been sold as a war for civilization against the Eastie Beasties, the Germans, the Hun, etc. That wasn't working as a propaganda tool by about 1916, and it was shifted to the war to end all wars. Fight this one and we're done. We won't fight anymore. It'll be over. So, and that's how people thought of it. It was the war to end all wars. They'd been sold it. So they had no problem with these massive armies being demobilised and sent home. The Australian Navy was reduced by about 90%. We'd done a great job. Our Navy had done a great job in the Great War. But it was reduced down. The ships were sent back to the Admiralty. The sailors were sent back into the community and into the merchant marine. The soldiers went back into their community. And like I said, the OC's disbanded in its entirety. There is no air element. Within a few years, as we know, people realised they'd backed the wrong horse. There was going to be more conflicts. Luckily enough for Australia, a group of enthusiasts kept the pot boiling about, we need an air force. We need some sort of aviation element to our defence force. And in 1921, the Royal Australian Air Force was formed. From that point forward, Army and Navy in Australia fly nothing. All flying, no matter what sort of flying it was all done by the Royal Australian Air Force. The interbellum rolls through, and as we know, much to the despair of the Europeans, I suppose, the Great European War of the 20th century kicks off again on the 3rd of September 1939. It's the same two teams, and they roll that out again. Between then and 1945, the Royal Australian Air Force does magnificent work. They fly in every theatre and in every campaign. We've just had the celebrations of 80 years since D-Day. Australia's the biggest by far contribution to that effort by Australia was Royal Australian Air Force. They are destroying U-boats in the North Atlantic while they're bombing the cities of Germany by night. They're shooting up Japanese convoys in the Bismarck Sea. They're defending Darwin in Spitfires. Les Knight throws the bomb out of the belly of his aircraft that breaks the Mona Dam on the Dam Busters raid, and so on and so forth. Like I said, magnificent work. However, there was a few things they didn't do particularly well. They didn't do light liaison, they didn't do light reconnaissance, and they didn't do what we call in the Army AIR-OP, or Airborne Observation Post artillery spotting. Basically, someone to look at where the artillery bombs are falling over the hill and where we need to move them to. They weren't good at it. They didn't understand it. There's no glory in it. It's not up there shooting down Messerschmitts and Zeros. It's basically working for the 17-year-old Year 10 educated kid with a rifle in his hands, and they weren't particularly interested in it. By 1943, Australian Army is agitating strongly to go with a model similar to both the US Army and the British Army by giving up their own independent air element to do that job on the battlefield. Our government basically says, well, look, we're right in the middle of defeating Nazi Germany and the Empire of the Sun. Can you get back to us in 5 years? Thinking the war would continue on. But as an interim, we will form number 16 and number 17 AIR-OP flight. It'll be staffed by RAF pilots, but the observers, the people looking out the window doing the work, for want of a better term, will be Army officers so that they can understand and tell and work the aircraft on the battlefield. The aircraft they're equipped with is the Auster Mk.III. It's a development of an aircraft called the Taylorcraft, which was an American company. Taylorcraft were an American company. The British redeveloped that aircraft, put a larger engine in it, did a few other small modifications to it, and turned it into a light observation aircraft, a battlefield support aircraft. And it was capable of carrying up to 4 people inside it, looking out the windows, doing those things. It could also do immediate casevac, so you could pick up wounded soldiers off the battlefield, carry ammunition, light loads, but carry ammunition, carry water, and so forth and so on. But one of its great claims to fame is it was air portable. You could undo bolts, fold the wings down, and put it inside a Dakota, so a C-47 Dakota. We never used them like that in Australia. So in 1943, that kicks off. Those two flights kick off. They train through 43 and 44. They're up top in the islands, fighting against the Japanese, or getting ready to fight against the Japanese. And on the 1st of May 1945, they go ashore. Number 16 AIR-OP goes ashore on Tarakan, in the first part of Operation Oboe, to take Borneo back. They go ashore at H+2. So you have the Saving Private Ryan at sort of H hour. 2 hours later, and how they get ashore is they are folded down like they're going to go into an aircraft, and then they're put on the back of army ducks. You've seen them in the movies, the floating trucks. They put them on the back of those, they balance them on there, and they drive them ashore. 2 hours after that, the wings are back on. They've been test flown, and they start flying missions off the beach at Tarakan within 200 metres of Japanese troops. It's an astonishingly good effort. The aircraft was really capable of that, and was a fantastic sort of asset to the soldiers then fighting the Japanese on Tarakan. For the next nearly 60 days, they fought on Tarakan. With that, we take our first, the Army, not flying character, we take our first flying casualty, so as a crewman, as a person on the aircraft, working on the aircraft, since the First World War. His name was Stanley Kett. He was an artillery officer, and he was killed on the 2nd of May, so D+1, when his aircraft hit a tussock of grass on that beach, rolled up, caught fire, and he was subsequently died of his wounds. He's buried in the No. 5 cemetery on Tarakan, but he's the first Army flyer to die since the First World War. So we're quite proud of Stanley. Stanley was a Chinese Australian, and his real name escapes me because I can't say it. I'm not going to embarrass him by that. But his second name, his family name was Arquette, so A-H-K-E-T in English. He had to change that because he wasn't allowed to enlist in the Australian Army as a Chinese. So yeah, things have changed a bit, but there it is. Things have changed a lot, but there it is. He was a Chinese Australian who had to change his name to be able to fight for his country. We keep using the Mk.III Auster until the end of the war. The end of the war rolls around. Number 17 Air AP flight, which had fought on Bougainville, is disbanded. Number 16 keeps rolling as an Air AP flight in Canberra. And in 1948, the Army starts to train its own pilots. And the way we do that is we send people to England, they learn how to fly, they come back and they start to teach Army pilots in Australia. And they slowly start to replace the RAF pilots in 16 Air AP flight. Through the 50s, we send pilots to Korea, and they fly with English units in Korea, flying the Mk.III. And we have another fatal casualty there. A guy called Joe Luscombe is killed in Korea. He's our second casualty. His name remains within our core. Joe Luscombe, the airfield in Vietnam that 161 flew at, was named Luscombe Field after him. When 161 came home from Vietnam, we brought the name of the airfield with us, and the airfield that the 6th Aviation Regiment operates out of in Sydney now is called Luscombe Field as well. So it sort of stayed with us. As we go forward through the 50s, we get the mid-50s, the aircraft's getting very old. It's a mid-30s design, and we're still using it in the mid-50s, and it was a pretty finite aircraft by that point. By 1958, there's moves afoot to start the first dedicated Army aviation element, and the aircraft are being sought out. And at that point, the Auster is really starting to run out of steam. It's a very old design by then. But in 1960, in December of 1960, 16 Air AP is officially disbanded, and immediately 16 ALA, or Army Light Aircraft Squadron, is formed in 1960. And it's formed using the Bell 47 Sioux and the Cessna 180, which I'll take you through now. So in 1960, the Australian Army's Light Aircraft Squadron, 16 ALA, is formed. And it is formed with the two aircraft being the Bell 47 Sioux and the Cessna 180. And we'll first look at the Bell 47 Sioux. Now, the Sioux is one of those aircraft that's sort of iconic, mainly because of a television show later, and it's like called MASH. It's that MASH helicopter that you see when Radar O'Reilly says choppers. It's an astonishingly capable aircraft, and to our 21st century eyes, it looks like a dinosaur helicopter. It's got the skeletonized tail, and you can see all the engines all hanging out sort of thing. It's got the big bubble front. It looks really old. But in 1960, the Sioux was cutting edge technology. It was the frontline aircraft the US Army was using for light observation. The Australian Army, desperately needed a vertical takeoff and landing aircraft to do reconnaissance and so forth, simply because we'd been fighting in the jungle since 1942 against the Japanese. And we kept fighting up in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia and Singapore and so forth and so on. We were fighting up there all the way through. Most people don't realise the Australian Army really never came home from that conflict. We just kept going back. The Sioux was, as I say, the frontline aircraft for the US Army, and it was the aircraft chosen. It started its design life in the 40s, so it's very much starts as a first generation helicopter, but maintains its position as a really important helicopter through and becomes a second generation helicopter in the early 60s. started with timber blades and so forth. It's by the time we get them, they've got the alloy blades, the alloy rotor blades, bigger engines, larger fuel tanks and so forth. By the mid-60s, we're replacing our initial buy of G2s with the G3 version, which was even more powerful and more capable, which is the aircraft you see behind you here is the G3 version. Its greatest claim to fame in Australian Army service is obviously with 161 recce flight in Vietnam, and they were there from 65 through to 72. And when they came home with the rest of the sort of the Vietnam deployment, flew many sorties, was on many missions. DFCs and so forth were won with the aircraft throughout that period, but it was also deployed at the same time into New Guinea, into Irian Jaya, Singapore, Malaya, and so forth and so on. And in fact, Australia's first real go outside Australia as part of a UN deployment was 2 Sioux aircraft fighting a cholera outbreak in Irian Jaya in Indonesia, so the other end of New Guinea. A cholera outbreak was there and they were sent up there to assist in the fight against that cholera outbreak. So it's our first sort of UN deployment as well for the aviation capability. It's the iconic aircraft of Army aviation. It's kind of that aircraft that's on the wall of every mess, you know, and where all the soldiers eat, there'll always be a photo of a Sioux because it's like the same, holds the same place in our psyche as sort of the 303 rifle for infantry and, you know, the 25-pounder gun for artillery. It's got that iconic place for itself. But between this and the Cessna 180, it brings Army aviation out of the 30s with the Auster and into the 60s almost straight away. As I say, the aircraft, we brought 2 aircraft into service at once. So we had the Bell 47 Sioux as our rotary wing asset. And at the same time, we brought into service the Cessna 180. Now, the Cessna 180 is from the Cessna company, funny old thing, but it's a very robust tail-dragging aircraft, which means it's very easy to maintain. And it was built initially as an aircraft for agricultural purposes, for farmers in places like Australia and Canada and Alaska and, you know, those wide open spaces around the world, so that you can find your fence post. You know, otherwise it's a 9-day horse ride sort of thing to get out to the corner post of your property. You could buy a Cessna 180 and it was a very easy to maintain aircraft and it was very difficult to break it. So they were exceedingly robust. So the Army bought them and didn't change them much. We didn't add anything to them, we didn't take anything off, we just painted them green and wrote Army on the side. And they were an enormous success for us. But their biggest their most important part in their implementation in Australian Army was to take us from the Auster Mk.III, which was a fabric-covered timber aircraft, and bring us into a all-metal skin, all-metal airframe aircraft. And it was a very big step forward as far as our maintenance and our technology was concerned. We used the Cessna 180 like we used the Sioux from 1960 until 1975, and both of the aircraft types were enormously important and enormously successful. I believe the Cessnas flew over 100,000 hours in their time in the Vietnam conflict. In the 7 years they were involved in Vietnam, they flew over 100,000 hours. Like I said, enormously successful. They could carry 2 pilots and then 2 passengers in the back, or a signals deck doing range finding and also chasing the opposition's radios and so forth. They could do that sort of stuff, radio direction finding and things like that. So they were a really important step forward technology-wise, just in the aircraft and also in its capabilities. So at the same time as the Army Light Aircraft Squadron is being formed, within Defence there is a need to start looking at the air mobility capability within Army, simply because we are becoming more and more engaged in Southeast Asia. The Air Force are tasked to send effectively a secret delegation to America to start looking into air mobile operations. And obviously at this point, the UH-1 or the HU-1 is being employed by the US Army. Now, sometime in the 50s, the US Army and Air Force had decided that all helicopter and sort of ground-based aviation would be Army aviation, and anything to do with the sky was going to be Air Force. We haven't made that delineation yet within Australia at this point. So the Air Force are sent They look into it. The Air Force were not particularly interested in doing helicopter operations, but they were tasked to do this because Australia needed to do it. In the end, we made our first buy of UH-1B, so the Bravo model of the Huey. We made that very early on. By 1962, we're starting the process of buying the aircraft, and they are full-time employed by about 1964-65. At that point, Australia gets more and more heavily involved in Vietnam. We've already got the training team in Vietnam, but by 1964-65, we are in lockstep with the Americans, and we're going to get ourselves enmeshed in the Vietnam conflict by about 1965. So by that point, we have an air mobile capability using the B model. By 66, 67, the Americans realised the B model isn't the aircraft it could be. They extend the fuselage, create the D model, Iroquois, which then is developed into the H model, so a few more radios and so forth. And that becomes the iconic aircraft that is in every single Vietnam War movie that you've ever seen. It's the H model Huey. And that's what is the aircraft behind me. Now, I need you just to use a bit of imagination, please, and remove all these guns, okay? And look at the aircraft without the guns on it. And in that format, we call it a slick, with no offensive armament on it, we call it a slick. And that is the tactical transport helicopter. And the combat power in a tactical transport helicopter is not the guns, it's this. It's the big empty space inside and what it can carry. So it can carry fuel, it can carry water, it can carry ammunition, it can carry barbed wire and star pickets, but most importantly, it can carry self-loading freight. And what is self-loading freight? Infantry. It'll carry infantry soldiers, and in this format, the aircraft can carry up to 9 fully equipped infantry soldiers, depending on conditions and fuel, but up to 9 fully equipped infantry soldiers, 2 pilots and 2 door gunners. The big thing there, though, is the aircraft is moving at 3,000 metres a minute. So within a few months of all this kicking off in Vietnam, people started to realise very quickly that at 3,000 metres a minute, we're starting to outrun the fire support for those infantry soldiers, the artillery back at their base, the mortars and artillery back at their base. So we're starting to outrun that. We're getting outside that fire support envelope very quickly, and almost straight away, people started to realise that we needed to be bringing our own fire support with us. And through 67, 69, everybody's starting to develop this sort of thing. There's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of different designs that are coming out of the Americans. The Royal Australian Air Force, number 9 Squadron, some engineers and some ground crew there get together. They have a few beers, they get together and they make up some stuff, and they go and get some things. They do a few dirty deals with the Americans for cartons of VB and slouch hats and GP boots and all sorts of stuff. They swap things and that, and they get a set of wings, they get some weapon systems, and they start to fiddle around and find what they think works best. And that's the aircraft you see behind you. It's the Australian Bushranger version of the UH-1H. It becomes the most heavily armed Iroquois or Huey helicopter in history. Not the most heavily armed helicopter in general, but the most heavily armed Huey. It's got a minigun at the front, a GE minigun, twin GE miniguns at the front, carrying 10,000 rounds of ammunition and firing up to 6,000 rounds a minute. Was downrated electrically to fire 4,800 rounds a minute, and then back here in Australia for training and so forth, was downrated again to 2,400. It's just a set of switches in the gun box, in the electrical control box. So it's just switching down, making the motor run slower. It's also, as part of its main armament, it's got 2 pods of 7 tubes, so 14 total, 2.75-inch folding fin aerial rockets. And they could carry up to a 17-pound warhead. And with the 17-pound warheads and 14 of them on the aircraft, it had more net explosive quantity on the aircraft than 3 rounds fired for effect out of an artillery battery. So it had more actual explosive on each aircraft. And then last but not least, it had the twin M60 machine guns as its door protection guns, okay? And if you can see the mannequin behind you there, that steely-eyed young mannequin with the cleft chin, that was me. I did that job for a long time, and it was a lot of fun. It was a great job to do. But both of those guns fire 600 rounds a minute each, and we'd carry about 4,000 rounds for those on the aircraft. So It was very heavily armed and very heavily, it had a lot of ammunition on board for all kinds of reasons, not the least of which most of the hydraulics and all the whiz-bangery that the Americans wanted to use was gutted out by the Australians to carry more ammunition. And the aircraft were fixed, the weapon system were fixed forward firing. They don't shoot off axis at all, they're always fixed forward. Pretty much analog watch and shoot. So it remained in service as a weapon system up until 2005. So we're continuously using the gunship pattern up until 2005. Now, you could stay on target with a single load with 2 aircraft, a light fire team. You could stay on target for about 40 minutes. With the ammunition you had on board, you could stay on a target. With the heavy fire team, which is 3 aircraft, so 3 aircraft doing the job, one could peel out, you'd leave 2 there still firing. One could peel out, go to a forward rearm refuel base, rearm and refuel, come back, rejoin, then the next one would roll out and go and rearm, refuel. You can stay on target indefinitely. You can stay on target as long as the aircrew can keep flying. You can stay on target as long as they don't as long as they can stay in the aircraft and keep doing the job. So they're a really effective weapon system in close battle. Obviously, they wouldn't survive in a 21st century battlefield, but they survived well enough in the Vietnam conflict and then into the 70s and 80s and right through until post the turn of the century with the Australian Defence Force. So as the Vietnam conflict continued, the US Army and obviously the Australian Army, because they were involved there pretty heavily and had an aviation element there. But we started to look for the replacement aircraft, rotor-wheeling aircraft for the Sioux. Whilst it had done a great job in the early parts of the conflict and continued to do so into the mid-60s, it was starting to run out of steam. Basically, what had happened to the Mk.III Auster, it was just getting so old, the technology in it was just running out of steam by that point. By 64, 65, the US Army is starting to put out feelers for its replacement. By 66, the actual requirement is put out and 2 companies turn up with prototypes. The Hughes company with the Hughes 500, and also known as Little Birds, and the Bell company with the Kiowa. The 500 was called, in military parlance, was called the Cayuse, and I'll just take a little segue here, little explanation. Most people don't get it, but all US military helicopters, or Army helicopters for a better term, are named after North American Indian tribes, or Native American Indian tribes. So Apache, Black Hawk, Kiowa, Cayuse, Iroquois, and so forth. They're all named after Indian tribes. But I digress. So the 2 prototypes turn up and they can't split them. They have a fly-off and they still can't split them. And in the end, it comes down to price. And Hughes were selling theirs for, and I'm paraphrasing, let's say $500,000 a copy. And the Bell company said, we can't make our helicopters for less than $1 million. And the US Army starts to buy the Cayuse, the Hughes 500. Within about 12 to 18 months, Hughes goes back to the US government, cap in hand, and says, we're undercutting ourselves so much. You're already committed to the airframe. We need to start charging you like $1.6 million for these aircraft. And the US government said, no, you don't, and turned immediately to the Bell company, and they started buying Kiowa hand over fist. Luckily enough, Australia had delayed our procurement program of our replacement for the Sioux until 1970. And in 1970, we leased 6 Kiowas off the US Army and flew them 71, as part of the squadron in Vietnam. And they were a great success and they really sold themselves to the pilots. And by 1971, we had contracted to buy our first 50 Kiowas. We did that and we bought them as Meccano sets effectively. So they were built at the factory, the parts and so forth were put together into a box, for want of a better term, with a big picture of a helicopter on it, and sent out to Fisherman's Bend. And we built them here in Australia, but out of a carton effectively, and did a great job of them. Now we built ours to the civilian standard, the 206B1 standard. We built them to a higher standard than the OH-58 Kiowa. We put taller skids on and a couple of other small, very small modifications. And in 1972, we took delivery of the first one into defence. They were an enormous success straight away. They were loved by pilots, beloved by pilots, right through. And we flew them from 1971 until 2018. Unbelievably good value for money for the Australian taxpayer. Towards the end of their career, from about 2013 on, they were taken off the front line as a reconnaissance asset, because that's mainly their job, was to look out the window and find the enemy. They're taken off the front line as a reconnaissance asset as the new helicopter, the Eurocopter Tiger, started to take over that role. And they were put into a training role only. Now, the Eurocopter Tiger has a really high-tech glass cockpit. It is enormously technologically advanced. And the Kiowa was 1960s technology, so it's all just dials and stuff. So as a training aircraft, the step up, the leap from that sort of analog 1960s technology to that high-tech digital technology in the Tiger was simply too large. And in 2013, a program was started to modify 13 of the old Kiowas into a half glass, half analog cockpit as a step up. So a pilot would learn how to fly and get his sort of stick skills. He would learn how to fly on the Kiowa using the analog. He would then go into an analog and glass cockpit combination and start using that glass cockpit and not being overwhelmed by the amount of information that a glass cockpit basically forces you to take in. And that was a wonderful success as in that program. But by 2018, the aircraft were just simply once again, running out of steam, getting too old for a military aircraft. We took the 36 that we had left. We had crashed 14 of them over its almost 40 years of service. We took the 36 that we had left and effectively put them on the market, and we made money back. We're getting like $170,000, $180,000 for aircraft that were 40 years old because they've been so well maintained. They were such a great aircraft. And as we all know, the Jet Ranger, the civilian version of this, was everywhere in the 70s. It was Dick Smith's helicopter to go around the world in. It was the Channel 7 chopper. It was the surf life-saving chopper. This aircraft is one of the greatest aircraft ever built. It is a worldwide phenomenon, and it is still the best-selling medium weight, because that's what this size is called in the civvy world, medium weight helicopter in the world. It is still the top seller ever. It is an absolute phenomenon, this aircraft. So we brought that into service. But at the same time, the Cessna 180 was running out of steam as well. So at the same time, in that mid-60s period, it's a big time, it's an important time for Australian Army aviation. So we're also looking to replace the Cessna 180. Now, we looked at that a little earlier. It's a metal-skinned aircraft. It's a very capable fixed-wing aircraft, but one of its biggest problems was it had quite a long takeoff and landing distance. We needed a shorter takeoff and landing, so STOL capability. We were looking around, and people had seen who were on deployment with 183 flight in Papua New Guinea. They'd seen an aircraft called the Pilatus Porter. And it was a wonderful aircraft for short takeoff and landing, and it was very robust. It was large. It could carry a lot of things in the back. It could do all sorts of stuff. It was a very large aircraft in comparison to the Cessna 180. And they recommended it as the replacement. The study was done, contracts were signed. The Pilatus company, which is Swiss, said, yep, we're going to sell you, I think in the beginning it was 24. Contracts are signed and so forth. And then as that's happening, there's a new version of the aircraft coming out called the Turbo Porter. So it's gone from a piston engine, and the Swiss company Pilatus basically said, we'll give you the Turbo Porter because we want it to get out there on sale. We'll give you the Turbo Porter at no extra cost. So it becomes the Army's first jet turbine aircraft. And it used Mr. Pratt and Mr. Whitney's first ever jet turbine engine, the PT6. And for those who were in the aviation game, the PT6, it's now the PT6-370 or something. So it's a long time ago. It was the ones with no dashes. It was the original version. But it's early on. So by 67, Australia's operating our first jet turbine aircraft. The Porter was enormously successful, both in Vietnam, outside of Vietnam, and within Australia. It could carry paratroops. It could cart large amounts of freight, in comparison to its predecessor. It had a wing stores capability which you could fire rockets off, you could drop stores off, you could carry other things on it. It was exceedingly short takeoff and landing. The legends of being able to take off at one end of a hangar, do a corner and land at the other end of the hangar, and so forth and so on. In the hands of some of the great Porter pilots, it was almost unbelievable what it could do. We used the Porter from 1967 until 1991, and it was probably taken out of service maybe a decade too early, on the back of another peace dividend. As we know, the Cold War ended towards the end of the 80s. The Soviet Union effectively flies apart and devolves into nothingness sort of thing. It becomes the Russian Federation and a whole bunch of little countries and so on and so forth. But the Australian Defence Force, as part of that, we lost a lot of aircraft were taken out of service. So the Porter was taken out probably early. The Wessex helicopters, probably at the time they needed to go, but they probably could have got another 5 or 10 years out of those. They were taken out of service. And at the same time, the CH-47s, the Chinooks, were taken out of service. So it was a very big we lost a lot of aircraft out of frontline service because of that peace dividend at the time. And the amount of people in service through the 90s were reduced, thinking it was the war to end all wars kind of thing. Once again, it was the end of the Cold War was the war to end all wars. It never is, but that's what people think. That's what governments want the people of Australia to think. So bless their hearts. The Porter, like I said, enormously successful. And they were flown out here into Australia with Swiss markings on them as stickers, because the Swiss didn't want to be involved in any kind of conflict sort of stuff about the Vietnam War. And when they arrived in Australia, the stickers were literally peeled off, and behind them were kangaroos and Australian markings kind of thing. So it was a kind of a surreptitious way of getting them out here, and they effectively went immediately to Vietnam. The Vietnam conflict finished in 1972, and as part of sort of all that winding up, the US Army realised pretty quickly, once they started to run the numbers, that the Iroquois, the UH-1H, the Huey, whilst it had done a sterling job and changed warfare forever and become an iconic part of modern warfare, it wasn't the right aircraft. And the reality is, a lot of them had been lost to enemy action. Thousands upon thousands of Hueys had been lost to enemy action during the conflict. And they were lost mainly to the gun behind me here. That's a Dushka. It's a 1938 Soviet-designed weapon. It's basically a 50 cal, 12.7 millimetre. And it was used by the Viet Cong and by the NVA, and it was almost their frontline anti-air weapon. Now, it's a really powerful gun, not particularly accurate, but it puts out enough rounds that if you hit a Huey with one of these projectiles, and they're almost as big as your thumb sort of thing, and they're coming at you at about 4,000 feet a second, a minute, I should say. No, a second. There it is. They really put big holes in the helicopter really quickly. So the Americans, they went back to the drawing board, and they put out effectively a list of things the next generation of helicopters couldn't be. They couldn't be single engine anymore. They couldn't have no armour in the floors. They had to have redundant systems, so redundant electrical systems, redundant hydraulic systems, redundant fuel systems, so that if the aircraft did get struck by a projectile, there was a way of continuing to fly and at least have the opportunity to get out of the battle space, if you could, or continue, and possibly even continue the mission. They gave it out to the manufacturers, as they'd done with the Kiowa and so forth, and the manufacturers came back, and the only viable prototype was the Sikorsky UH-60 or X-60, the original version of it. And through 72 and so forth, they started to develop this airframe, this aircraft. And by 1974, it had come to fruition as the UH-60 Black Hawk. And it is basically an evolution of every single rule, everything that the Americans learned about helicopter combat, and all the things that they learned that were written in blood. And they were written in the blood of operators throughout the Vietnam conflict. And it was built into the aircraft behind me, the Black Hawk. So in the early to mid-80s, the Australian Defence Force was looking to replace its own UH-1H aircraft for air mobility within the Australian Defence Force. The only real viable option was the Black Hawk, and we started to look into that. At this point, the Air Force was still flying all of the air mobile aircraft, and they put out basically a call to the American manufacturer Sikorsky that they wanted an improved UH-60. The UH-60 doesn't come normally fitted with a hoist, with a hook, with external stores systems, or any of those kind of things. It didn't at the time come with a computerized control handling system, okay? The AFCS. The Australians the Air Force went there, and they basically said, we want the Seahawk AFCS. So that the flying control system, it's computerized. We want a hoist, we want a hook, we want this, we want that. And in the end, it's not a different aircraft, it's the same aircraft, but it's got a lot of add-ons, let's put it that way, okay? It's the luxury version, for want of a better term. And it becomes the S70A9. So S70, Australia, and the 9th version of it. So S70A9. With that, it effectively creates an export version of the Black Hawk for Sikorsky, which goes worldwide, essentially. Any buyer pretty much buys the Australian version or a very slightly modified version of the Australian version. In the mid-80s as well, there's a very big controversy within Australian Defence Force as to who is going to operate battlefield aviation. Air Force have done this job since the early 60s. They've been doing this job. They did it right through Vietnam. I don't want to talk to the controversies between Air Force and Army about that conflict particularly, but there was a lot of things that weren't being done that the Army wanted done. There was things that the Air Force should have been doing that they weren't. There was things the Army were demanding. There was a lot of controversy. Some very big conferences, some very high-powered decisions were made. But in 1986-87, the decision was taken to transfer the responsibility for battlefield aviation to Army. By this point, the contract has already been written to buy Black Hawk, and the first 3 or 6 come to Australia with Air Force markings on them, and then the decision is taken to transfer them all to Army. And by 1987, they become an Army asset. And from that point forward, pretty much the Air Force effectively stops buying or flying helicopters, and I'll talk more to that as things move along. But the helicopter is, once again, a global phenomenon. It is a worldwide Blue Force asset, for want of a better term. Almost every other country in the world operates this or a version of this. You know, it is it's probably the best battlefield helicopter ever built because, like I said, everything in it, its rule book was written in blood, okay, when they were designing this aircraft. It's got 19mm rolled steel armour as its flooring, for example. So you see all those Vietnam War movies where the soldiers sit on their helmets and all that sort of stuff. You don't have to do that in a Black Hawk, for want of a better term. And everything on it is capable of defeating the Dushka. It's 50 cal capable, for want of a better term. You can shoot this up with 50 cal bullets and the aircraft will keep operating. It's got redundant systems in all of its major systems. It's got 2 pilots. The pilots sit in armoured seats in an armoured bathtub. You know, the engine cowls are Kevlar armour. The fuel tanks are in Kevlar armour bathtubs as well. So everything about it is about surviving the battlefield. We've been operating these since 87, 88. We stopped operating this version, the version behind me, in December of 2021. It was taken off the line. Its replacement, the MK.III Taipan, was not all the Army wanted it to be, and we'll talk more to that in a moment. But as we speak, as this goes to print, the Army is returning to Black Hawk with the more modern, uprated Mike model Black Hawk. So we're, as we speak now, I think there's about 6 of them already in service at 6th Aviation Regiment down in Sydney. So we're returning to this aircraft, and we've gone away from the MK.III. So, like I said, it's been a wonderful success for us. It has flown in, its first operation was in Cambodia, but it's been in basically every single flood or cyclone relief operation within Australia over the last 30 years has had Black Hawks on it. It flew in Bougainville, it flew in Cambodia, operationally in Timor, and so on and so forth, right through. It has been the cornerstone of the modern Army aviation capability. So in the late 1990s, like all defence forces around the world, Australia starts to look at replacing its last piece of equipment, sort of thing. So we were operating the Black Hawk at the time, and the project begins to find the replacement for it, you know, probably 6 or 8 years before its actual sort of use-by date. The Australian Defence Force took the decision to try and rationalise its helicopter fleet down into as few types as possible. So there was very much a push to use an aircraft which was capable of doing both Army and Navy roles. Through the early 2000s, several aircraft were looked at, including the then uprated Black Hawk and so forth. But in 2006, the decision was taken to buy the Eurocopter MH90 multi-role helicopter MH90, the aircraft that I'm currently sitting on. Right from the start, there was problems with the aircraft, and we had to start doing a lot of research and a lot of development to create a military helicopter. One of the problems, and this is a personal opinion, one of the problems with the MH90 is its original design philosophy was as a transport aircraft to go from places like England out to the rigs, the big oil rigs in the North Sea. That was what its original purpose was designed for. It wasn't designed for the battlefield. So there's many issues with it. But it essentially came down to the fact that the cargo compartment, and if you remember when we were back talking about the Iroquois, it's the big empty space behind me. That's the combat power in a transport helicopter, and that's what this is. It's a transport helicopter. The combat power is the cargo compartment. So it never worked properly for us. The ramp at the back takes too long to come down. We can't really use it for deployments and so forth. Other countries took the option of removing the ramp altogether, you know, things like that. The door here is too small to operate things like the fast rope, which I'm standing next to, which is where special forces will slide down, and the gun mount behind me. So you can't operate a gun and protect the soldiers sliding down this rope at the same time. You can't do the two things. So we couldn't use the door properly. The floors were too soft, and it went on and on and on. There's many things wrong with the aircraft. The front end for the cockpit and its systems, its sensor systems and so forth, are unbelievably capable. And the aircraft is the most advanced aircraft we've ever operated, without a doubt, as far as that's concerned. But the basic thing that the aircraft does never really turned out that well. The decision was taken in late 2023 after an incident in the Whitsundays, in which 4 crew were killed, to remove the aircraft from service immediately. There was already a process to remove it by about 2026. The decision was taken to make that happen more quickly, and then to go and do an accelerated program to get Black Hawk back into 6th Aviation Regiment in Sydney as a priority, which, as I said before, is already happening. The MH90 is one of those things. It was a wonderful aircraft on paper and a wonderful aircraft to do the job. It never actually reached the potential it could have done. Australia spent many millions, in fact billions of dollars, trying to redevelop the aircraft into the aircraft that we need for this nation, and it's never been able to really get there. As I said, it's a wonderful aircraft, don't get me wrong, it's a great aeroplane, but just not for the job we needed it to do in Army. It's now out of service completely. There's only 2 left in one piece in the whole country, and they are the 2 that the museum owns. This one here, and the other aircraft that we have in storage has been removed. It's had its engines removed and its sensor systems removed and so forth. It's basically a shell of what you see here. This aircraft is complete, but it's the only one left complete in the whole country. Once again, we're sort of in that period where we're still operating Chinook at the same time as we're operating the new Black Hawk after the replacement of the MH90, but the Chinook, the CH-47, starts its design life well before any of these other aircraft. Okay? In 1960, at the same time as the UH-1H is being developed, the Iroquois is being developed, this aircraft is being developed to operate in that air mobile battle space. So the Huey is the assault aircraft, which will carry the soldier into battle, and they will fight and sort of defeat the enemy. The exploitation phase will then be carried out by the Chinooks. And as you can see behind me, it's an enormous empty space, that tactical transport aircraft. In this case, that the space that this aircraft provides is massive. And that's the exploitation phase. So we can bring in lots of soldiers, lots of stores, exploit the victory, and then move on from there. And its initial sort of thought process that they would blacken the skies with Chinooks, almost like trains, going through the air, and just pile in there. That never really came to fruition for the Americans because they're very expensive to build and operate. But they realised how capable the aircraft was, and the A model Chinook gave birth to the C model, which becomes the quintessential model in the Vietnam conflict that we see in all those movies and that sort of stuff when you see Chinooks. Australia bought 12 C models in 1972. The last of the Conservative governments before the Whitlam government's victory in 1972 had decided that it wasn't going to be Army aviation, it was going to be an aviation army. We were going to be an air mobile force of about 30,000 people. So the orders were in for up to 200 Hueys, up to 200 Kiowa, and 36 of the Chinooks. The first buys that got through before the change of government were the first 50 Kiowas and the first 12 Chinooks. And so our Chinooks, Australian Chinooks, never went to Vietnam. Those contracts were written and fulfilled. The aircraft came out here. When the Whitlam government was elected, they decided to stop all those contracts, and all those contracts petered out. As we know, historically, they pulled us out of Vietnam basically on the night of the election. They stopped conscription on the night of the election, and the Australian military landscape changed almost instantaneously. With that, Australia started flying their Chinooks in 1974. They got them out here, and the first test flights and so forth, people had been sent to America to learn how to fly them and maintain them. But the first test flights of our own aircraft were done here in 1974. In fact, on the 10th of July, 1974. The Chinook has evolved from there. In Australian service, we kept flying, we took our 12, and because they're very expensive to maintain as well as build and operate, they're very expensive to maintain, so the decision was taken to put 6 into mothballs, fly 6 online, for want of a better term, and then every so often rotate 1 in and 1 out of mothballs. So we just kept sort of moving them in and out. In 1989, as we know, we talked about the peace dividend after the Cold War. The Chinook was taken out of service in a joint decision by Army and Air Force. It was taken out of service. The remaining aircraft, we had 11 left out of our initial 12. 1 had been written off in a crash. We had 11 left. They were all put into mothballs, and it was an easy process because they'd done it so many times. The aircraft were set aside. Nobody really knew what to do with them at the time. Within a couple of years, Army is they're basically desperate to get the Chinook back because we've backed the wrong horse. We need the Chinook in service to do medium lift large amounts of fuel, lift big guns and so forth in the battle space. Some unbelievable staff work, some really skilled and dedicated staff officers, most of them quite young, work a plan between Army and Air Force in Australia and Boeing and the US Army in America. Negotiations are done, and they're done at the highest level, but negotiations are done to trade in, for want of a better term, our 11C models with Boeing. They would refurbish them into the new D model helicopter, which meant bigger engines, better transmissions, better avionics, but the airframe remained the same. And the reason this was possible was our aircraft was so low in hours because we'd been rotating them in and out of mothballs. Our aircraft was so low that it was possible just to use the same airframe and rebuild the aircraft around it. So we got a package of 4 back. So we got 4 Chinooks back with a maintenance package, with a training package for both aircrew and ground crew, and a spares package. It is a bargain. It's probably the best deal the Australian Defence Force has ever made, or one of them. Deals they've ever made. And we started flying 4 in 1996. Within a couple of years, we bought a couple more, and a couple of years after that, we bought a couple more. We went off to Afghanistan, we lost a couple in combat, which we replaced and so forth. And in 2016, so we flew the initial version, the one behind me, the D model, from 1996 in Australia, right through to 2016. It was taken out of service, and there was almost a seamless transition from that to the new F model Chinook, which is currently being flown, and there's 14 of them being flown in Townsville as we speak. That kind of brings us to the end of the tour, for want of a better term, of Army Aviation's heritage sort of thing and its history from 1911 right through to the modern day. We're currently operating the Tiger attack helicopter, armed reconnaissance helicopter. It's being replaced over the next couple of years. The first Apaches will get here, the AH-64. The E model of the Apache will be coming in sort of 2025, 2026. The first ones of those that will arrive, and the Tiger will come off the line. The F model Chinook will continue to be operated, and the M model Black Hawk will continue to be operated. As we speak at this time, the Army, the division, the simple division of aviation asset within the Defence Force it's a fairly simple one. The Army has no fixed wing asset at this time, and the Air Force have no helicopters. So all the low, slow aircraft, the vertical takeoff aircraft that support the land battle are with Army, and all the aircraft that support the air battle are with Air Force. And the simple way of looking at that is, imagine you're a pilot sitting in your pilot seat. If you're in the Air Force, you look up at the sky. That's where you fight. If you're an army pilot, you look down at the ground because that's your battle space. So you're looking down at the ground, and you need to go as slow as an infantry soldier does, pretty much. So we have the low, slow aircraft that do the vertical takeoff stuff.
We would like to extend an enormous thanks to the Australian Army Flying Museum at Oakey in Queensland, and especially our guide, Scott Downs, for a fantastic history lesson and detailed description of their wonderful collection. If you appreciate our work, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, and don't forget our Substack where you can financially support us so we can do more of these videos. You'll find all the details in the description.